Welcome back to Queen City Corals. I'm Graham, and today we're going to be going over our SPS system, from filtration to lighting to all the different corals we have in this system. So without further ado, let's jump right into the video. So this system is 8 feet by about 2.5 feet by about 2 feet tall. Then we've got two 60-gallon deep blue frag tanks attached and plumbed into here. And then finally, we've got our 75-gallon sump down at the bottom. Now this is just a normal 75-gallon tank, and we didn't put baffles in this one. We put baffles in a lot of our other sumps, but with this one, we just didn't really need to. There's filter socks in the back of this tank here. It's kind of like an all-in-one. It has a little section back here with some filter socks. And then we don't really have an extensive refugium on here just because we don't really find the need for one. And we have our skimmer just kind of sitting in the middle with the pump nearby. We've got a return pump, obviously, a heater, and then we've got a UV sterilizer and the pump for that. And that's pretty much all the equipment in the sump down here. We've also got a little fuge light, and I just threw some macroalgae in there, but not a real refugium that we have, just kind of some macroalgae floating around just to help with the pH a little bit at night. And then as far as the UV sterilizer goes, we use that running at a very low flow rate. We found that it helps to keep down things like parasites as well as coral diseases. So there's some disagreements on whether it's things like ciliates, bacteria, parasites, but we found that the UV sterilizer, especially running at a very low flow rate, kind of helps deal with a lot of those issues. However, this is definitely our most quarantined system. I don't put any acroporas in the system that haven't gone through a full quarantine process, and that's because I've dealt with a lot of pests on these acroporas before in the past, and I don't want to deal with that again, because it is not fun. The treatments range from taking all the corals out and dipping them to doing a whole in-tank treatment that can be somewhat aggressive and a little bit annoying for some of the corals. So we typically will do a full course of treatments on any new acros before they come in, just to make sure they don't have anything like white bugs or acro-eating flatworms that can really take over the tank and really inhibit our ability to grow our acroporas here. So moving on from some of the equipment down in the sump, on the other side, we've got some of our dosing containers. So on this system, there are also some trace elements that I hand dose, but as far as the auto dosers that we have set up, we use Chem Fusion 1 and 2, and then we use the ESV nitrate. This is a sodium nitrate based dosing, and we used to use the Neo Nitro by Brightwell and the Neo Phos, but these are potassium phosphate and potassium nitrate supplements. And what was happening is our potassium was getting really elevated. So we ended up switching over to our own phosphate that we mix up. And that one, I believe, is also sodium phosphate. And then we've got sodium nitrate. And that helps to decrease our potassium levels that were getting a little too high and could have been possibly part of the reason why we're seeing a little bit of paling out, because once your potassium gets too high, it can definitely disrupt the internals of the corals because it's just not in the correct proportions. So we dose all those, and then we dose Red Sea magnesium, and this tends to keep our elements pretty stable. We use the Neptune dose on this system, and that's mainly because it is one of our two systems that have the apex right next to them, so it makes it really easy to run the lines for that dose. And the other reason is I've found that it's very consistent. And of course, we dose very large quantities of things like alkalinity and calcium. For example, we are dosing 195 mLs of Fusion 2 a day and 150 mLs of Fusion 1 a day. So it really helps to have a pretty beefy dosing pump, because that enables us to dose all that large amounts of fluids while also being able to dose some of the finer elements like phosphate and nitrate in smaller amounts that are going to be a little bit more precise. So that's pretty much all we dose automatically. However, Every day or every other day, I go through and I will dose manganese, I'll dose iron, and I will also dose iodine. Now, periodically, depending on our ICP test, I'll also dose things like zinc and sulfur. However, I wait on those especially to send out the ICP tests because you don't want them getting too elevated. I recommend never dosing anything you can't test for. Again, like with our potassium, if we would have been following another guide that recommended dosing potassium with some of the other trace elements, our potassium levels would probably be at almost deadly levels. And because we test for our potassium and all the other elements in the ICP, we're able to understand what our potassium levels are and not only not dose it, but try to actually lower these levels through water changes, as well as obviously switching from potassium nitrate and potassium phosphate. Now with this system, I usually send out an ICP test about once a month or every 2 weeks. And that is mainly just because I have so many corals in here that they will take up a lot of trace elements. And I wanna make sure that I'm replenishing them, especially the ones I can't test for, things like manganese, that are definitely important for the growth of these corals. And especially I've got a couple of gonnies over here in this tank, a couple of micro gonnies. And I can tell you from experience, whenever my manganese gets bottomed out, those gonnies completely close up. And for a little while, I was trying to figure out what it was. Sent out an ICP test, my manganese was 0. I started dosing manganese, and within about 2 days, they opened up to their full extension, with their polyps being 3, 4, sometimes even 5 inches long, which is really great extension, especially for these microgonies. So things like that are very important, and why I send out the ICP test so frequently on the system. Now, if I wasn't doing as much fragging and things like that, I would probably send out the ICP a little bit less. But because this system gets cut so frequently and has so much growth, it's really important to keep a close eye on those parameters. So that way I'm able to maintain a stable system, which is definitely the key when you're keeping acroporas and SPS in general. Now, as far as all of my parameters, I normally keep alkalinity between 8 and 9. I normally keep my calcium between 4 and 450, and I normally keep nitrates and phosphates, not necessarily at specific numbers, but more so in a ratio of each other. I follow the Redfield ratio, which you want to keep 100 to 1 on your ratio of nitrates to phosphates. So if your phosphates are at 0.05, you want your nitrates to be at 5. And what this has done is definitely improve the color on these acroporas. And I've noticed much better growth since I've been doing that. When I get a little bit out of that range, I'll start to see things like nuisance algae or even red slime pop up. Sometimes even I've seen diatoms, and that's just not something that I need in this system in particular. Because the SPS are so sensitive, I try to keep everything perfect for these guys. And so I will usually keep my nitrates around 15 and my phosphates around 0.15 because of that. So I've found that this higher nutrient level really brings out a lot more color than keeping things closer to 0. And I've had my nitrates in this system get as high as 50, and everything looked fantastic. I had great coloration, and that, in my opinion, is because I kept the phosphates also relatively elevated. And again, I have higher light on this system. So because of those factors, I really didn't run into any of the issues people run into sometimes when they're running higher nitrates and phosphates. Now, when it comes to magnesium, I usually keep that between 1350 and 1500. I've found that keeping it a little on that higher end, 1400, 1500, really helps to decrease the amount of algae that grows. That is pretty much all the parameters that I dose for regularly. So next up, I will get into some of our flow. So for our return pumps, I've got one return pump that operates this tank right here, and then I have a second return pump for both of the frag tanks, and they are both J-Bow DCP 18,000s. Those put out 18,000 liters per hour, but I don't have them running all the way up. I have them at about 80-90%, so I'm getting a little bit less than that, but it definitely provides pretty good turnover for these systems. Now, the power heads in these systems are primarily the J-Bow power heads. We use a lot of them. However, on this system, I also have a max spec gyre all the way on the left side, and that provides the bulk of the flow across this system. And then I've got 6 pumps along the back of this tank. So there's 5 that are just on the back wall, and then the 6th is also on the back wall, but it's tilted up vertically, and that basically just clears out the detritus from that corner, that front corner of the tank. And the other gyres help to clear out the rest of the detritus. On the 2 frag tanks, I have a J-bow gyre on the left side of each of the tanks, and that does a pretty good job of providing flow. Typically, the way that I know these guys have enough flow is their polyps are moving pretty well, which they definitely are. And the other thing I look for is that all the detritus is settling in 1 or 2 different areas. So on these SPS systems, on the frag tanks, all of the detritus ends up landing straight under the pumps, which is good because it allows me to just siphon it all out. So I know that all the flow is getting around and I'm not having any big dead spots there other than directly below the pump, which is exactly where I want it to be. Now, same thing in this tank. I don't have too many dead spots. I love seeing the acros on their frag plugs shaking because they love flow, and I really like providing a lot of flow for them. So if those frag plugs are shaking, I know they've got enough flow. And they definitely are enjoying the high flow because they've got their polyps fully extended. That's another big thing that I look for is the polyp extension. If some of them aren't extending fully, they're either not getting enough flow, enough light, or too much of either of those, or there could be something else irritating them. But those are the 2 things I look to first, is the flow and the lighting, mainly just because they're gonna be the easiest to problem solve and adjust. Speaking of lighting, for these systems, I've got them both lit with radions, and then on the frag systems, I've also got T5s. I've got those set up on a T5 hybrid. So I've got 4 bulbs on each of those frag systems. I've got 2 Coral Plus, an Actinic Plus, and then a Blue Plus bulb. And those run for about 4 to 6 hours. I have all 4 on for 4 hours, and then I run just 2 of them for a full 6 hours. And that gives me a pretty good level of par, especially with the radions. In the frag tanks, we're looking at about 250 to 350. And then in this system, where I've got 7 radions, I'm getting anywhere from 300 to about 400 par. And I like that because, again, I'm running a little bit higher nutrients. And I've found with those higher nutrients, you want to have higher light because it enables them to fully take up those nutrients and utilize them properly. I've found that if you don't have enough flow and high light while you have those high nutrients, you can run into some of the issues with the corals browning out. So I typically try to keep this system high light, high flow, and high nutrients. When it comes to the schedule for these guys, I run it fairly white. Overall, our lighting is pretty simple. We have the blues turned up pretty high, and then we run our whites for about 6 to 8 hours a day just to give them enough par. As I said, I like to run higher lighting, and so the white light really helps to bring in more par that I just really can't get out of the blue light alone. So on this system, I've got 5 of the Radion XR30 Gen 6 Pros, and then I've got 2 of the Gen 4 Pros. I like the Gen 4 Pros more, but unfortunately I'm only able to get my hands on 2 of these guys. And I do like the diffusion of the other XR30s, the Gen 6s. It is really good, but the par of the Gen 4s is definitely a lot better, and it's more focused, but you get a little bit less diffusion out of that. So I kind of put that over some of the higher light acros that I want. And on the other frag systems, I've got 4 Gen 4 XR15s, and then I've got 2 XR30s. Those are also Gen 4. And that is because, again, I want the higher par out of those guys. And because I've got the T5s on there, I don't need to worry too much about the diffusion because they're gonna cover and really blanket that whole tank really well. I would say that my favorite piece in here that is not an acro would definitely be this grafted Lazy's Blue Zing bird's nest. We call it the Twisted Time Machine now that it's grafted. It's grafted with a neon green bird's nest and the Lazy's Blue Zing. This is one of my favorite pieces just because it grafted in our system. So we had it sitting next to a neon green bird's nest, and the neon green fluorescent protein actually jumped over to the colony, and it now grows all along it. It'll prop up on the exact opposite side of it, which is really cool, and we get some really nice grafting out of it. Definitely a really cool piece. Now in the frag tank, you'll notice there are quite a few non-SPS, and that is largely the hammer colonies in the back left corner, and those guys are some that we're growing out. I've found that I get a little bit better coloration here with the T5s because it's such high par. And again, because I'm running higher nutrients, the LPS usually do pretty well in here. I've also got some torches on the right side that we're growing out. And then as I mentioned, I got a couple of Gonioporas, and those are just some that I really like. And for some reason, they don't open up in my Goni system, but they do open up over here. I'm really not sure why, because I dose manganese to both, but they just end up doing better in this SPS system, and so this is where I've kept them. Now we've got a lot of larger colonies in this system, but we also have some smaller frags, both that we're growing out into colonies and some that we have for sale. Typically what we do is I will go ahead and frag some of these pieces, and then I'll put them in the left frag tank, and that is to let them heal up, start to encrust, and once they are starting to encrust, nice and healthy, we'll set them up on these little photo stands that we have here, and they'll get photographed and put onto the website, and they'll, after they're photographed, get moved over to the right tank, which is where most of our for sale Acroporas and SPS are going to be, and that basically just helps us keep things a little bit organized. Overall, this system is definitely my favorite. It is one that I pay a lot of attention to, not just because it's my favorite, but because with SPS, you really do need to keep a very close eye on things. If you see any polyps closed or an acro that's angry, it might just be a one-day thing. You come back the next day, everything's looking fine. But if it's not the next day looking happier, it really is time to start to inspect things, test your water, look for any bite marks. It could be a pest, things like that, because these guys definitely can go pretty quickly. Look for polyp extension, look for coloration. If they start fading in color, try to figure out what that could be. Any sort of toxin or heavy metal that could be being leached in. I know that we lost a lot of Acroporas due to metal leaching from some of the frag plugs we used to use, and so we ended up correcting that. And now everything is doing great, and it definitely is the most rewarding type of coral to keep because they are so challenging, but they are one of the fastest growing corals. Other than some of the soft corals like zoas and clove polyps, these guys really are quick growers. Sometimes they get a bad rap about being slow growers, but that's oftentimes because they aren't kept in the best conditions, and they are either irritated by some sort of pest or some sort of water parameter that's out of whack. Now, when it comes to water changes for this system, and all of our systems in general, we usually do water changes once a week on all the systems. And with this one, it's the same. Because we're doing so many water changes, we try to make it really easy on ourselves. So we've got a 100-foot Python hose that we just run straight outside and we siphon. And then we've got a line that's run from our mixing station over to here. And we can just open that valve, fill it back up after we're done siphoning, and we're good to go for the week, which makes it really easy, especially when we're doing about a 10% water change on this system, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have this much water, and especially with this many systems, that 10% works out to about 1,000 gallons, if not more, every single week that we're ending up changing out. That is pretty much all I have to say about this system. I think I've kind of gone through everything we have here, all the different corals we have in the system, as well as how we maintain it, how we go through it all. If you guys have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can leave them in the comments down below, message us on Facebook, send us a text message on our phone number listed on our website, give us a call. I'm happy to talk about Acroporas any day of the week. I love talking about these guys because they definitely are my favorite. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to leave a like down below. If you want to stay up to date with all our latest content, you guys can subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.